As midterms loom, we've seen increasing allegations of voter suppression by Republican officials in red states. And this week, civil rights groups sued the state of Georgia over Associated Press reports that Republican Secretary of State and gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp is blocking tens of thousands of mostly black residents from registering, largely as Democrats, and thus favoring his opponent, Stacey Abrams. And in Texas, the state's online registration portal failed for 36 hours, just 4 days ahead of this week's deadline. But state Republicans remain convinced that the real threat is from illegal voting. Joining me now is Dr.Victoria DeFrancesco, MSNBC contributor and professor at the University of Texas LBJ School of Public Affairs, and Derrick Johnson, president and CEO of the NAACP. Derrick, let me go to you first. You and many of us in the civil rights community that have been working together have been outraged not only with Georgia, where I think Jim Crow himself would blush at this maneuver that has been used, but around the country, we've been dealing with repeated, clear cases of what appears to be intentional voter suppression.
Absolutely. And first of all, Al, congratulations on getting another hour to hear your important voice. Like you, the NAACP, we are monitoring the process of election across the country. We are now preparing to file a lawsuit in Tennessee, where we're seeing an election commissioner withholding tens of thousands of newly registered voters. Their applications have not been processed. We're looking at cases in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. This year's election cycle is an important election cycle, and based on our polling, African Americans feel disrespected, and as a result of that, they are registering to vote, and they're going to turn out in record numbers.
Victoria, tell us what happened in Texas, where you are teaching and located, because I think this is an example of what Derrick is referring to, that many of us in the civil rights community has monitored on a nonpartisan basis, I might add, across the country.
Absolutely, Reverend. So it's been shenanigan after shenanigan. A little over a week ago, Vote.org had 2,400 voter registrations denied by the Secretary of State, saying they didn't meet all of the qualifications necessary, namely that the signature was electronic. The voter law is unclear on that, but nevertheless, the Secretary of State rejected it outright. And then a couple of days later, last Friday afternoon, the voter registration link with the application goes down, and it's down for 36 hours. And
wow.
Granted that the deadline to register to vote here in Texas was this past Tuesday. And so it just felt a little bit too close for comfort. And then a couple of days later, we see a state senator, a Republican state senator here, call for an emergency committee hearing on election security because of concerns about the massive voter registration rates of folks who are not citizens and not eligible to vote. So all of those illegals, quote unquote, voting and trying to register. So you add all of these up and you get this picture of where Texas, you know, that very ugly history that we had tried to get away from, that Jim Crow era history, seems to be creeping back. And let's not forget that it wasn't too long ago that we had the Texas voter ID law. So you take the Texas voter ID law and all of this other stuff, and you see the concerted effort to quell the voices of especially our minority communities.
Much of the summit, Derrick, many of those in the civil rights community, including and especially the NAACP, has spent a lot of time dealing with the Supreme Court nomination and judicial nominations, which has not gotten the same amount of publicity, but we have seen President Trump nominate and the Senate confirm many right-wing people to the federal courts, which are lifetime appointments. Is the danger that now we are looking at a judiciary that would uphold some of these in these laws and some of these voting allowances that really will suppress people of color and people of a certain income from being able to exercise the right to vote that the civil rights movement secured?
Well, it was the Supreme Court who took out Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which opened the door for Georgia to do what it's doing, for Texas to do what it's doing, for North Carolina to do what it tried to do as a result of the preclearance measure. The long game is control of the federal courts. It is through the federal courts that civil rights were advanced in this country, and it will be through the federal courts of the undoing of the civil rights legislation that we've seen pretty much make democracy work in this country. Elections have consequences, and as a result of the presidential election of 2016, we're seeing a sharp turn to try to get control of the federal bench. It is important for African Americans and Latino Americans and well-minded other Americans to go vote during these midterm elections so we can slow this process down, put some checks and balances on the White House, and ensure that all of our children's future are brighter than the path that we know could be very dark and grim, particularly in the Jim Crow South.
Francesco, right now, this system has no real checks and balances in terms of policy. The legislative branch, the executive branch, and judicial branch is now headed by right-wingers. How do we deal with that, and is that the reason this midterm election becomes very important?
It falls on our shoulders, Reverend. It falls on the shoulders of voters, and that's why it is so important that we see these mobilization efforts by nonpartisan organizations to get folks motivated to turn out and vote. Folks who usually don't turn out and vote, regrettably in the Latino community, we know a big chunk of Latinos have not been in the habit of voting. We need to change that habit, because changing that habit among Latinos, among African Americans, among white folks who previously have not voted and want to see those checks and balances, we have to get them first to register and then get them out to the polls. So that's on us.
Thank you very much, Victoria DeFrancesco and Derrick Johnson, on our first night at 5 o'clock. We'll be